The September sun beat down mercilessly on Odessa Turner as she stumbled through the dusty streets of Fort Kearny, Nebraska, clutching her carpet bag with trembling hands and fighting back tears that threatened to spill down her sunburned cheeks. Her dress was torn at the hem from where her uncle's wife had physically shoved her out the front door an hour earlier, the sound of the heavy lock clicking into place still echoing in her mind like a death sentence. She had nowhere to go, no money in her pockets, and the only home she had known for the past 3 years was now barred to her by a woman whose cruelty knew no bounds. Odessa was 22 years old, a slender young woman with chestnut hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and green eyes that usually sparkled with determination, but now held only desperation and exhaustion. She had come to Fort Kearny in 1873 to live with her Uncle Bernard after her parents had died in a cholera outbreak back in Pennsylvania. Uncle Bernard had been kind enough, a widower who ran a modest but successful dry goods store on the main street. For 3 years, Odessa had helped him run the business, kept his books, minded the store when he traveled to Omaha for supplies, and made his house a home again with her cooking and care. Then, 6 months ago, everything had changed. Bernard had met Constance Walker at a church social, a widow from Iowa with sharp features and sharper words. The courtship had been brief, the wedding even briefer, and suddenly Odessa found herself sharing a home with a stepmother who was only 15 years her senior, and who viewed her with immediate and inexplicable hostility. Constance had wasted no time asserting her authority as the new Mrs. Turner, criticizing everything Odessa did, from how she swept the floors to how she arranged the pantry shelves. But Uncle Bernard, besotted with his new bride, seemed blind to Constance's treatment of his niece. This morning had been the culmination of 6 months of mounting tension. Uncle Bernard had left before dawn for a 3-week buying trip to Kansas City, leaving Odessa alone with Constance for the first time. The moment his wagon had disappeared down the dusty road, Constance had turned on Odessa with vicious accusations. She claimed that Odessa had been stealing from the household funds, that she was lazy and worthless, that she was trying to turn Bernard against his new wife. Before Odessa could even form a coherent defense, Constance had grabbed her by the arm, dragged her to her room, allowed her only enough time to stuff a few possessions into her carpet bag, and then physically forced her out of the house. "You have no claim to this property," Constance had hissed through the partially open door. "Bernard may have pitied you, but I will not tolerate a conniving little opportunist under my roof. If you try to come back, I will call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing. Do not test me on this." The door had slammed shut, and Odessa had heard the heavy iron lock slide into place with terrible finality. She had stood on the porch for nearly 10 minutes, alternating between pounding on the door and pleading with Constance to at least let her explain, to at least give her time to make arrangements. But there had been no response from within, only the oppressive silence of a house that was no longer hers. Now she wandered the streets of Fort Kearny with no destination in mind. The town was bustling with its usual afternoon activity. Freight wagons rumbled past, heading to or from the railroad depot. Cowboys drove cattle through the wide main street, shouting and whistling to keep the herd moving. Women in bonnets hurried between the mercantile and the post office, their arms full of packages. Children played in the dust outside the schoolhouse. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to do, a place to call home. Everyone except Odessa. She considered her options as she walked, each one more dismal than the last. She had $2.30 in her reticule, hardly enough to secure even a week's lodging at the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher, who ran the establishment, was a good woman, but she was not a charity, and she had her own bills to pay. Odessa had no other relatives in Nebraska, no close friends who could take her in on such short notice. The few women she knew from church were kind enough, but they had their own families and problems to worry about. She could not simply impose on their hospitality indefinitely. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Odessa's throat grew parched. She had been walking for over an hour with no clear direction, and now she found herself on the outskirts of town near the livery stable and the corral where horses were broken and traded. She sank down onto a wooden bench outside the stable, setting her carpetbag beside her, and pressed her palms against her burning eyes. For the first time since her parents had died, Odessa felt truly alone in the world. "You all right, miss?" The voice startled her, and she looked up to find a tall man standing a few feet away. His hat tilted back on his head and genuine concern etched across his sun-weathered face. He was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and slightly too long, curling at the collar of his faded blue shirt. His eyes were a striking gray blue, the color of storm clouds over the prairie, and they regarded her with an intensity that was somehow both penetrating and gentle. "I am fine, thank you," Odessa said automatically, though her voice cracked on the last word and gave the lie to her statement. The man studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her thin veneer of composure. His gaze took in her torn dress, her dusty carpetbag, her red-rimmed eyes, and the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you do not look fine," he said quietly. "You look like someone who has had a mighty rough day and could use some help." Something about his directness, the simple kindness in his tone, made the tears Odessa had been holding back finally spill over. She turned her face away, mortified to be crying in front of a stranger, but unable to stop the sobs that shook her shoulders. She heard the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs as the man moved closer, and then he was pressing a clean handkerchief into her hand. "There now," he said softly. "Whatever it is, it cannot be so bad that a good cry will not help at least a little." Odessa took the handkerchief gratefully and pressed it to her eyes, trying to regain some semblance of control. After several minutes, the tears subsided enough for her to speak. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I do not usually fall apart like this in front of strangers." "No need to apologize," the man said. He had settled onto the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that his presence was comforting rather than threatening. "My name is Xavier Harrison. Most folks just call me Xavier. I work as a horse breaker and ranch hand for the Double H Ranch about 10 miles north of here." "Odessa Turner," she replied, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief. "Or at least, I was Odessa Turner. I am not certain who I am anymore." Xavier tilted his head, studying her with those penetrating gray-blue eyes. "That sounds like a story worth telling, if you have a mind to share it." Perhaps it was exhaustion, or desperation, or simply the relief of having someone, anyone, show her genuine kindness, but Odessa found herself pouring out the entire sorry tale. She told Xavier about her parents' death, about coming to live with Uncle Bernard, about Constance's arrival and the 6 months of escalating hostility, and finally about being locked out of her own home that very morning. Xavier listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. "That is a hell of a thing," he said when she had finished. "Begging your pardon for the language, but there is no other way to describe it. Your uncle knows about this." Odessa shook her head. "He left for Kansas City this morning before dawn. He will be gone for 3 weeks. By the time he returns, I will be long gone from Fort Kearny. I cannot afford to stay here with no money and no place to live." Xavier was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing over a difficult problem. Finally, he turned to face her fully. "Miss Turner, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want to get back into that house?" Odessa blinked in surprise. "Of course I do. All my belongings are in there. My mother's jewelry, the quilt my grandmother made, letters from my parents. And the house rightfully belongs to my uncle, not to Constance. She has no legal right to lock me out." "That is what I thought," Xavier said, and there was a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "In that case, I am going to help you get back in." "But how? Constance said she would call the sheriff if I tried to return. She will have me arrested." Xavier stood up, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "Let her try. From what you have told me, you have been living in that house for 3 years, helping to support the household and working in your uncle's business. You have every legal and moral right to be there. Your uncle's new wife, on the other hand, has no right to forcibly evict you from your home in his absence." He held out his hand to Odessa. "Come on, let us go have a talk with Mrs. Turner." Odessa stared at his outstretched hand, her heart pounding. Part of her was terrified at the thought of confronting Constance again, but a larger part was filled with sudden hope. She reached out and placed her hand in Xavier's, letting him pull her to her feet. "I do not even know you," she said, but she was already picking up her carpetbag. "Why would you help me like this?" Xavier's expression softened. "Because it is the right thing to do, and because I have seen too much cruelty and injustice in this world to stand by and do nothing when I have the power to help." He offered her his arm. "Besides, I have a strong dislike for bullies, especially ones who prey on people who cannot fight back." They walked back through town together, Odessa's hand resting lightly on Xavier's arm. She was acutely aware of the curious glances from passers-by, but Xavier seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on their destination. As they approached the Turner house, a modest but well-maintained 2-story structure on a quiet street lined with cottonwood trees, Odessa felt her courage beginning to waver. "What if she really does call the sheriff?" she whispered. "Then we will explain the situation to him," Xavier replied calmly. "But I do not think it will come to that. Bullies like your stepmother typically back down when someone stands up to them." They climbed the steps to the front porch, and Xavier raised his hand to knock firmly on the door. There was a long silence, and then Constance's sharp voice called out from within. "Go away, Odessa. I warned you what would happen if you came back." "Mrs. Turner," Xavier called back, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite its even tone. "My name is Xavier Harrison. I am here with Miss Odessa Turner, and we need to speak with you about the situation that occurred this morning." Another silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. It opened a crack, and Constance's pinched face appeared in the gap, her eyes narrowing when she saw Xavier standing beside Odessa. "Who are you?" she demanded. "This is a family matter and none of your concern." "It became my concern when I found Miss Turner wandering the streets in distress after you illegally evicted her from her home," Xavier said, and though his voice remained calm, there was steel beneath the words. "She has been living here for 3 years with your husband's permission and support. You have no right to force her out, especially in his absence." Constance's face flushed with anger. "I have every right. I am Bernard's wife, and this is my house now. Odessa is nothing but a freeloader and a troublemaker." "That is a lie," Odessa said, finding her voice at last. "I have worked in Uncle Bernard's store for 3 years. I have kept his books, managed his inventory, and helped increase his profits by nearly 20%. I have cleaned this house, cooked the meals and tended the garden. I have more than earned my keep." "Then you can explain that to Bernard when he returns," Constance snapped. "Until then, you are not welcome here." Xavier stepped forward, and something in his posture made Constance instinctively step back. "Mrs. Turner, I am going to make this very simple for you. You have two choices. You can open this door right now and allow Miss Turner to return to her rightful home, or I can go fetch the sheriff, and we can all have a conversation about illegal eviction and theft of personal property. I am confident that once the sheriff hears the full story, including the fact that Miss Turner has been a resident of this house for years while you have been here only 6 months, he will take a very dim view of your actions." Constance's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You cannot threaten me in my own home." "I am not threatening you, madam. I am simply explaining the legal reality of the situation." Xavier's voice was patient but implacable. "Miss Turner has belongings in that house that are legally hers. By preventing her from accessing them, you are committing theft. By forcibly evicting her without proper notice or legal cause, you are violating her rights. Now, we can settle this quietly and reasonably, or we can make it a matter for the law. The choice is yours." For a long moment, Constance stood frozen, her face a mask of fury and indecision. Odessa could almost see her stepmother's mind working, calculating the risks and benefits of different courses of action. Finally, Constance's shoulders sagged slightly in defeat. "Fine," she spat. "She can come in and get her things, but I want her out of this house by nightfall, and I do not want to see her again." "That is not good enough," Xavier said firmly. "Miss Turner will return to her room and resume her place in this household until your husband returns. At that time, he can make the decision about living arrangements, as is his right as the head of the household and Miss Turner's legal guardian. Until then, you will leave her alone." "I will do no such thing," Constance hissed. "Bernard would never allow her to stay if he knew what she has been doing behind his back." "And what exactly has she been doing?" Xavier asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Constance faltered. "She has been stealing from the household funds, pocketing money from the store, spreading lies about me to the neighbors." "Can you prove any of that?" Xavier asked. "Because if you can, then by all means present your evidence. If you cannot, then you are making false accusations, which is another matter entirely." Constance said nothing, her face growing even redder. "I thought not," Xavier said. "So here is what is going to happen. You are going to step aside and allow Miss Turner to enter her home. She is going to return to her room and unpack her belongings, and you are going to leave her be. If I hear that you have made any further attempts to harass or threaten her, I will make it my personal business to ensure that your husband hears the full truth of what happened here today. Do we have an understanding?" For a moment, Odessa thought Constance might actually slam the door in their faces. But then, with a sound of disgust, her stepmother pulled the door open wide and stepped back. "Fine," she said coldly. "But this is not over. When Bernard returns, he will hear my side of things." "As he should," Xavier agreed. "And he will hear Miss Turner's side as well, and then he will make his decision based on the facts, not on lies and manipulation." Odessa stepped cautiously past Constance into the familiar entryway, her heart pounding. The house looked exactly as it had when she had been forced out that morning, but it felt different now, contaminated somehow by the ugliness of what had transpired. Xavier followed close behind her, his presence a comforting bulwark against Constance's hostility. "Go on up to your room," Xavier said quietly to Odessa. "I will wait down here." Odessa nodded and climbed the stairs to the second floor, acutely aware of Constance's venomous gaze following her every step. Her room was at the end of the hall. A small but cozy space with a brass bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a writing desk positioned beneath the window. The room appeared undisturbed, and Odessa sent up a silent prayer of thanks that Constance had not had time to ransack her belongings. She unpacked her carpetbag slowly, hanging her spare dress in the wardrobe and returning her few toiletries to the washstand. Her hands were shaking, and she sank down onto the edge of the bed, overcome by a wave of exhaustion and relief. She had her room back, at least for now. But what would happen when Uncle Bernard returned? Would he believe Constance's lies? Would he side with his new wife over his niece? After a few minutes, Odessa composed herself and returned downstairs. Xavier was still standing in the entryway, his arms crossed over his chest, while Constance had retreated to the parlor and was making a great show of ignoring them both. "Thank you," Odessa said quietly to Xavier. "I do not know how I can ever repay you for what you have done." Xavier's stern expression softened when he looked at her. "No repayment necessary, Miss Turner. I am just glad I could help." He hesitated, then added, "But I do want to make sure you are going to be all right here. That woman is not going to make life easy for you." "I will manage," Odessa said, though she was far from certain of that. "I have dealt with her hostility for 6 months. I can endure another 3 weeks." Xavier did not look convinced. "I am going to give you the address of the Double H Ranch where I work. If you need anything at all, you send word and I will come. You understand?" Odessa felt a lump form in her throat at his concern. "I understand, but you have already done so much." "I have done what any decent person should do," Xavier said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper and a pencil stub, scribbling something quickly before handing it to her. "That is the address. The ranch is about 10 miles north on the main road. Anyone in town can give you directions." Odessa took the paper, folding it carefully and tucking it into her pocket. "I will remember. Thank you, Mr. Harrison." "Xavier," he corrected gently. "Just Xavier." "Xavier," she repeated, and for the first time that day she felt a genuine smile touch her lips. He nodded, seeming satisfied. "I need to get back to the ranch before dark, but I will be in town again in a few days. Perhaps I could call on you then, just to make sure everything is all right." "I would like that very much," Odessa said. Xavier tipped his hat to her, cast one last warning glance toward the parlor where Constance sat in stony silence, and then let himself out the front door. Odessa watched through the window as he untied his horse from the hitching post and swung up into the saddle with easy grace. He looked back at the house once, and their eyes met through the glass. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and then he was riding away down the dusty street. Odessa stood at the window long after he had disappeared from view, one hand pressed against the glass, her mind whirling with the events of the day. She had gone from utter desperation to tentative hope in the span of a few hours, and it was all because of a stranger's kindness. A stranger named Xavier Harrison, with storm-cloud eyes and a quiet strength that had made her feel safe for the first time in months. Behind her, she heard Constance rise from her chair and move toward the stairs. "Do not think this changes anything," her stepmother said coldly. "When Bernard returns, you will be out of this house for good." Odessa turned to face her, and to her own surprise, she felt no fear, only a calm determination. "That will be Uncle Bernard's decision to make, not yours, and I have 3 years of honest work and loyalty to speak for me. What do you have except 6 months of jealousy and lies?" Constance's face contorted with rage, but she said nothing, merely turned on her heel and stalked up the stairs to her bedroom. A moment later, Odessa heard the door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. That night, Odessa lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She kept replaying the day's events in her mind, from the horror of being locked out to the relief of being let back in. But most of all, she thought about Xavier. The way he had listened to her story without judgment. The way he had stood up to Constance without hesitation or fear. The way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, as if she were something precious that needed protecting. She barely knew him, and yet he had treated her with more kindness and respect than her own family had shown in months. What kind of man would do that for a complete stranger? And why did the memory of his voice, steady and sure, make her feel things she had not felt in years? Odessa pulled the covers up to her chin and closed her eyes, but sleep remained elusive. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, and the sound seemed to echo the loneliness in her own heart. She thought of the piece of paper tucked safely in her pocket, with its promise of help if she should need it. She thought of Xavier's parting words, his offer to call on her in a few days. And for the first time since her parents had died, Odessa allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not as alone in the world as she had believed. The next 3 days passed in a state of cold war between Odessa and Constance. Her stepmother did not speak to her except when absolutely necessary, communicating primarily through pointed silences and hostile glares. Odessa kept to herself as much as possible, spending her days helping out at Uncle Bernard's store, which Constance had no choice but to allow since someone needed to mind the business in Bernard's absence. The store's clerk, an elderly man named Mr. Pemberton, was grateful for Odessa's presence and made no secret of his disapproval of Constance's treatment of her. "That woman is poison," he muttered to Odessa on the second day, when Constance had stopped by the store to check on things and had made several cutting remarks about Odessa's handling of a customer. "Your uncle must have been out of his mind when he married her. She has not got a kind bone in her body." Odessa said nothing, but she appreciated Mr. Pemberton's support more than she could express. It helped to know that at least someone in Fort Kearny saw Constance for what she truly was. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Odessa was arranging a display of canned goods in the store's front window when she heard the bell over the door jingle. She turned, expecting to see a customer, and felt her heart give a peculiar leap when she saw Xavier Harrison standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and a slightly uncertain expression on his face. "Miss Turner," he said, nodding politely, "I hope I am not interrupting your work." "Not at all," Odessa said quickly, aware that her cheeks were flushing. "I am glad to see you. I wanted to thank you again for your help the other day." "No thanks necessary," Xavier said, but he looked pleased nonetheless. "I was in town picking up supplies for the ranch, and I thought I would stop by to see how you were getting on." "I am managing," Odessa said. She glanced around the store to make sure Mr. Pemberton was occupied with a customer at the back counter, then lowered her voice. "Constance is not speaking to me, which is actually an improvement over being screamed at." Xavier's jaw tightened. "She has not tried anything else. No more threats or attempts to force you out. No, nothing like that. I think your visit put the fear of God into her, or at least the fear of legal consequences." "Good," Xavier said with satisfaction. "That was my intention." He shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Miss Turner, I was wondering if you might have some free time this afternoon. I thought perhaps I could show you around town a bit, maybe get some coffee at the hotel restaurant, if that would not be too forward of me." Odessa's heart began to beat faster. "I would like that very much. Mr. Pemberton can manage the store for an hour or so." Xavier's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious features. "That is wonderful. I will just browse a bit while you finish up with your display." Odessa completed her work with the canned goods in record time, trying not to look too eager but failing miserably if the knowing look Mr. Pemberton shot her was any indication. She removed her work apron, smoothed down her hair, and retrieved her bonnet from the back room. "I will be back in an hour," she told Mr. Pemberton. "Take your time, dear," the old man said with a wink. "I can hold down the fort." Xavier offered Odessa his arm as they stepped out into the bright afternoon sunshine. Fort Kearny's main street was busy with the usual afternoon traffic, but Odessa barely noticed the wagons and horses and bustling pedestrians. She was too aware of Xavier's presence beside her, the solid strength of his arm beneath her hand, the faint scent of leather and horse, and something indefinably masculine that made her head spin. They walked to the Overland Hotel, a 3-story brick building that was Fort Kearny's finest establishment. The restaurant on the ground floor was nearly empty at this hour, the lunch crowd long gone, and the dinner patrons not yet arrived. They settled at a table by the window, and Xavier ordered coffee and a plate of the hotel's famous apple pie to share. "So tell me about yourself," Odessa said when the waitress had departed. "You said you work at the Double H Ranch, but how did you come to be in Nebraska?" Xavier leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a distant look. "I was born in Missouri, on a small farm outside of Independence. My father died when I was 12, and my mother struggled to keep the farm going on her own. When I was 16, I headed west to make my own way. I have worked ranches in Kansas, Colorado, and now Nebraska. Been doing it for 10 years now, and I reckon I am pretty good at it." "What do you do at the ranch?" Odessa asked. "Mostly I break horses," Xavier said. "The Double H buys wild mustangs and I gentle them for riding and ranch work. It is hard, sometimes dangerous work, but I love it. There is something honest about working with horses. They do not lie or manipulate or play games. They are what they are, and if you treat them right and earn their trust, they will give you everything they have." Odessa heard the unspoken contrast in his words, the implicit reference to human relationships that were far more complicated and painful. "It sounds like you have been hurt by people who lied and manipulated," she said quietly. Xavier's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise and something else flicker in their gray-blue depths. "I suppose I have, but I could say the same about you from what you have told me about your stepmother." "I suppose you could," Odessa agreed. The waitress arrived with their coffee and pie, and they busied themselves with the rituals of adding cream and sugar, cutting the pie into portions. When they were alone again, Odessa said, "What about your mother? Is she still in Missouri?" A shadow crossed Xavier's face. "She passed away 5 years ago, pneumonia. I went back for the funeral, but there was nothing left for me there. The farm had been sold to pay debts. I have been drifting from ranch to ranch ever since, never staying anywhere too long." "That sounds lonely," Odessa said softly. "It has been," Xavier admitted. "But I am starting to think maybe it is time to put down roots somewhere. The Double H is a good outfit, and the owner has hinted that if I stay on, there might be a chance to become foreman in a few years. It would mean a steady job, good pay, a future." "That sounds wonderful," Odessa said. "You should take it." "Maybe," Xavier said, but he was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There are other considerations now." Before Odessa could ask what he meant, the door to the restaurant opened and 2 women walked in. Odessa recognized them immediately as Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Whitmore, 2 of the biggest gossips in Fort Kearny and regular attendees at the same church services Odessa and her uncle frequented. The women's eyes widened when they saw Odessa sitting with Xavier, and their heads immediately bent together in whispered conversation. Xavier noticed Odessa's change in expression and glanced over his shoulder to see what had caught her attention. "Friends of yours?" he asked. Acquaintances, Odessa said carefully. They attend the same church as my uncle and I. They are also the two biggest sources of gossip in Fort Kearny. By tonight, everyone in town will know that I was seen having coffee with a strange man. Xavier frowned. Does that trouble you? I did not mean to damage your reputation. My reputation has already been damaged by Constance's lies, Odessa said with more bitterness than she intended. I am sure she has told everyone who will listen that I am a thief and a troublemaker. At least having coffee with you is something I actually did. I am not sure whether to be flattered or insulted by that, Xavier said, but his eyes held a glint of amusement. Odessa felt herself relax slightly. It was meant as a compliment. You are probably the most respectable thing that has happened to me in months. They finished their coffee and pie while the two gossips watched from across the room with barely concealed interest. When they finally left the restaurant, Odessa was acutely aware of the whispers that started up the moment they stepped out the door. I am sorry about that, she said to Xavier as they walked back toward the dry goods store. Small towns can be very unforgiving when it comes to matters of propriety. I do not care what they think, Xavier said firmly, and neither should you. You have done nothing wrong. Constance will hear about this, Odessa said. She will use it against me somehow. Xavier stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Odessa, listen to me. Your stepmother is a bitter, cruel woman who will find fault with everything you do regardless of whether you give her actual ammunition or not. You cannot live your life in fear of her disapproval. All you can do is hold your head high, tell the truth, and trust that people who matter will see through her lies. Odessa looked up into his earnest face and felt something shift in her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. You barely know me, she whispered. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? Xavier's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders, and for a moment she thought he might pull her closer. But then he released her and stepped back, though his eyes never left hers. I cannot explain it, he said quietly. From the moment I saw you sitting outside that stable, looking so lost and hurt, I felt something. A connection, a pull. Like I was meant to find you that day. Like maybe we were meant to help each other through whatever comes next. Odessa's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. I felt it too, she confessed. And it terrifies me because I do not understand it. I do not believe in fate or destiny or love at first sight. Those are things from fairy tales and romance novels, not real life. Maybe, Xavier said. Or maybe sometimes real life can be like a fairy tale if we are brave enough to let it. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give, Odessa. I just want to see you again. To spend time with you, to get to know you better. Will you let me do that? Odessa knew she should be cautious. She had known this man for only 4 days. She had her hands full dealing with Constance and waiting for Uncle Bernard to return. This was the worst possible time to be developing feelings for someone, especially when her entire future was so uncertain. But when she looked into Xavier's eyes, all those sensible objections melted away, leaving only a simple truth. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. Xavier's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Then I will come back tomorrow if that is all right. We could take a walk, maybe have dinner together if you are willing. I am willing, Odessa said, and she squeezed his hand before reluctantly releasing it. But I should get back to the store now. Mr. Pemberton will be wondering what happened to me. They walked the rest of the way in companionable silence, but Odessa was acutely aware of every glance Xavier sent her way, every accidental brush of their arms as they walked. When they reached the store, Xavier tipped his hat to her. "Until tomorrow, Miss Turner." "Until tomorrow, Xavier, and please call me Odessa." "Odessa," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "It suits you. It is beautiful and strong and a little bit unusual." Odessa felt herself blushing like a schoolgirl. "You are full of compliments today, Mr. Harrison." "Xavier," he corrected with a grin, "and I am simply stating facts." He touched the brim of his hat once more and then turned away, heading toward the livery stable where he had left his horse. Odessa watched him go, then floated into the store on a cloud of happiness that even Mr. Pemberton's knowing look could not diminish. That evening, when Odessa returned to the Turner house, she found Constance waiting for her in the parlor with a triumphant expression on her pinched face. "I heard you were seen having coffee with some drifter this afternoon," Constance said without preamble. "Carrying on like a common saloon girl in full view of half the town. Your uncle is going to hear about this, I promise you." "I had coffee with a friend," Odessa said calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. "There is nothing scandalous about that." "A friend?" Constance's voice dripped with disdain. "You met this man less than a week ago. What kind of decent woman throws herself at a strange cowboy like that?" "The kind who appreciates kindness and respect when it is offered," Odessa said, "qualities that are sadly lacking in this house." Constance's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way? When Bernard hears about this, you will be out on the street for good." "We shall see," Odessa said. She was surprised by her own calm in the face of Constance's anger. Perhaps it was Xavier's influence, his quiet strength and unshakable certainty that right would prevail. "If you will excuse me, I am going to my room." She left Constance sputtering in the parlor and climbed the stairs to her room, locking the door behind her. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to relive every moment of the afternoon, from Xavier's arrival at the store to his declaration that he wanted to see her again. She pulled out the piece of paper with the address of the Double H Ranch and traced the letters of his handwriting with her fingertip, marveling at how much her life had changed in just a few short days. She barely knew Xavier Harrison, and yet she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced with anyone else. Was it gratitude for his help, loneliness seeking any port in a storm, or was it something deeper, more real, more dangerous? She did not know, but she knew she could not wait to see him again. Xavier arrived the next afternoon just as he had promised, and Odessa met him outside the store, having arranged with Mr. Pemberton to take the rest of the day off. They walked through Fort Kearny together, talking about everything and nothing. Xavier told her stories about his adventures breaking wild horses, and Odessa shared memories of her childhood in Pennsylvania before illness had stolen her parents away. They laughed together at shared jokes, fell into comfortable silences that needed no words to fill them, and discovered a dozen small things they had in common. When evening came, Xavier took her to the hotel restaurant for dinner, and this time Odessa did not care who saw them or what gossip might result. She was happy, truly happy, for the first time in years, and she refused to let fear or propriety steal that away from her. Over roast chicken and potatoes, Xavier asked her about her plans for the future. "What will you do if your uncle sides with Constance when he returns?" he asked gently. "Have you thought about what comes next?" Odessa had thought about little else in the quiet moments of the past few days. "I will have to leave Fort Kearny," she said. "I have a little money saved, not much, but enough to buy a train ticket somewhere. Maybe I could find work as a teacher or a seamstress in a larger city. Omaha, perhaps, or even Denver." Xavier was quiet for a moment, pushing his food around his plate. Finally, he looked up at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made her heart ache. "What if you did not have to leave?" he said. "What if there was another option? What do you mean? Odessa asked, though her pulse had begun to race. Xavier reached across the table and took her hand. I know this is going to sound crazy. We have known each other less than a week, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, Odessa. When I am with you, I feel like I have found something I did not even know I was looking for. Like all the drifting and searching and loneliness was leading me to this place, this moment, you. Odessa's throat was tight with emotion. Xavier, I feel the same way, but that does not change my circumstances. I am still dependent on my uncle's charity, still at the mercy of a woman who hates me. You would not be if you married me, Xavier said, and though his voice was steady, Odessa could see the tremor in his hand where it held hers. I know I am not much of a catch. I am just a ranch hand with no property and not much saved. But I am hardworking and honest, and I would spend every day of my life making sure you were safe and happy and loved. Say yes, Odessa. Marry me and come live at the ranch. We can build a life together, a real life with a real home where no one can ever lock you out again. Odessa stared at him, stunned, speechless. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to throw caution to the wind and grab this chance at happiness with both hands. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to be careful and cautious through years of hardship, held her back. Xavier, this is too fast. We barely know each other. Marriage is a serious commitment, not something to rush into on a whim. I know that, Xavier said. And if you need time, I will give it to you, but I want you to know that my offer is sincere. I am not asking you to marry me because I feel sorry for you, or because I am trying to be heroic. I am asking you because when I look at you, I see my future. And I cannot imagine going back to the way things were before I met you, drifting from place to place with no one to care about and no one to care about me. Tears pricked at Odessa's eyes. You barely know anything about me. What if you discover things you do not like? What if I am not the person you think I am? Then we will deal with those things together, Xavier said simply. That is what marriage is supposed to be, is it not? Two people facing life's challenges side by side, supporting each other through good times and bad. Odessa pulled her hand free and pressed it to her face, trying to think clearly through the whirlwind of emotions. Everything was happening so fast. A week ago, she had been locked out of her home with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Now here was this man, this kind, strong, impossibly generous man, offering her not just help but a future. It was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. I need time to think, she said finally. This is too important a decision to make in a moment of heightened emotion. Can you understand that? Xavier's face fell slightly, but he nodded. Of course, I did not mean to pressure you. Take all the time you need. Thank you, Odessa whispered. They finished their dinner in near silence. The easy companionship of earlier replaced by a tension that was not quite uncomfortable but definitely weighted with unspoken thoughts and feelings. When Xavier walked her back to the Turner house that evening, he stopped at the end of the street, well out of sight of the house's windows. I am going back to the ranch tomorrow, he said, but I will be in town again on Saturday. Will you have an answer for me by then? I will try, Odessa said. Xavier, I want you to know that I am not saying no. I am just saying I need time to be certain. This is too important to get wrong. I understand, Xavier said. He reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Whatever you decide, Odessa, I will respect it, but I hope with everything in me that you say yes. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, and then he was gone, walking away into the gathering darkness. Odessa stood frozen for several long moments, one hand pressed to the spot where his lips had touched her skin, her mind and heart in complete turmoil. The next 3 days were the longest of Odessa's life. She went through the motions of her daily routine, helping at the store, avoiding Constance as much as possible. But her mind was constantly occupied with Xavier's proposal. Part of her thought she would be insane to accept. They had known each other less than 2 weeks. What if it was just infatuation or gratitude masquerading as love? What if they married and then discovered they were completely incompatible? She would be trading one form of dependence for another, one uncertain situation for a different uncertainty. But another part of her, a part that grew stronger with each passing hour, whispered that Xavier's offer was the best thing that had ever happened to her. He was kind and honest and strong. He had stood up for her when no one else would. He made her laugh and made her feel safe and made her believe that perhaps she could be happy again. Was that not worth taking a risk on? Friday evening, Odessa sat in her room writing a letter to Uncle Bernard. She had decided that regardless of what happened with Xavier, her uncle deserved to hear the truth about what had transpired in his absence. She carefully detailed everything that had happened from the moment he left for Kansas City to the present day, holding nothing back. She wrote about Constance's accusations and cruelty, about being locked out of the house, about Xavier's intervention and Constance's threats. She wrote about how she had continued to work at the store despite everything, how Mr. Pemberton could attest to her honesty and dedication. And then, her hand trembling slightly, she wrote about Xavier's proposal. She explained that she had met a good, honorable man who had offered her a future. She told her uncle that while she hoped he would support her decision, she understood if he felt she was moving too quickly. She promised to abide by whatever decision he made about her future living arrangements, but asked that he hear her side of things before making his final judgment. When the letter was finished, Odessa sealed it carefully and addressed it to the hotel in Kansas City, where Uncle Bernard was staying. She would post it first thing in the morning. With that decision made, she turned her attention to the other, more pressing question. What was she going to tell Xavier? She lay awake most of the night, turning the question over and over in her mind. By the time dawn broke over Fort Kearny, she had made her decision. It was risky and impulsive and possibly foolish, but it felt right in a way nothing else had in years. She was going to say yes. Saturday afternoon found Odessa pacing nervously in her room, waiting for Xavier to arrive. She had dressed in her best day dress, a soft blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and had taken extra care with her hair, pinning it up in a style that was both practical and flattering. Her hands would not stop trembling, and she kept rehearsing in her mind what she would say when she saw him. At precisely 3 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. Odessa heard Constance answer it, heard the sharp, unwelcoming tone of her stepmother's voice, and then Xavier's deeper tones responding. She took a deep breath, grabbed her shawl and reticule, and hurried downstairs before Constance could make a scene. Xavier was standing in the entryway, looking uncomfortable under Constance's hostile glare. His face lit up when he saw Odessa descending the stairs. "Good afternoon, Odessa," he said, his eyes searching her face as if trying to read her decision there. "Good afternoon, Xavier," she replied. She turned to Constance with a polite smile. "I am going out for a walk. I will be back before dinner." "I am sure you will," Constance said coldly. "After all, you seem to have no shame about parading yourself around town with every cowboy who pays you attention." Xavier stiffened, his jaw tightening, but Odessa laid a gentle hand on his arm. "It is not worth it," she said quietly. "Let us just go." They stepped out into the crisp autumn afternoon, and Odessa deliberately led Xavier away from the main street toward the quieter residential area on the edge of town. They walked in silence for several minutes, Xavier clearly waiting for her to speak first, Odessa trying to find the right words. Finally, when they had reached a small park with a few wooden benches scattered beneath ancient cottonwood trees, Odessa stopped and turned to face him. "I have been thinking about your proposal every moment of the past 3 days," she said without preamble. "I have made lists of all the reasons why I should say yes, and all the reasons why I should say no. I have tried to be practical and logical and sensible about it." Xavier's face was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "And what did your lists tell you?" he asked. "They told me that marrying someone I have known for less than 2 weeks is impulsive and possibly foolish. That we barely know each other, that we might discover we are completely incompatible once the initial infatuation wears off." Xavier's shoulders sagged slightly. "I see. So you are saying no." "I am saying that my head tells me to say no," Odessa corrected. "But my heart is telling me something completely different." She stepped closer to him, reaching up to place her palm against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her hand. "My heart tells me that you are the best man I have ever met, that you stood up for me when no one else would, that you make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I have not felt since my parents died. My heart tells me that maybe, just maybe, love at first sight is not just something from fairy tales. Maybe sometimes 2 people meet and just know that they are meant to be together." Xavier's eyes were blazing with hope now, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. "What are you saying, Odessa?" "I am saying yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will come live at the ranch. Yes, I want to build a life with you." For a moment, Xavier simply stared at her as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then, with a whoop of joy that sent birds scattering from the trees overhead, he picked her up and spun her around, holding her tight against him. When he set her down, he was laughing, his eyes bright with happiness. "You mean it. You are not just saying yes because you feel trapped or desperate." "I am saying yes because I want to," Odessa said firmly. "I am saying yes because when I think about my future, I want you in it. I am saying yes because you make me happy in a way I did not think was possible anymore." Xavier cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing gently across her cheekbones. "I promise you will not regret this. I promise I will spend every day proving that you made the right choice." "I know I will not regret it," Odessa said. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Xavier leaned down and kissed her then, a soft, sweet kiss that tasted of promise and hope and new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling like fools, and Odessa felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. "When?" Xavier asked. "When can we get married?" "As soon as possible," Odessa said. "I posted a letter to Uncle Bernard yesterday explaining everything, but I do not want to wait for his return. I am of age and can make my own decisions. If we can find a preacher willing to marry us, I would be happy to do it tomorrow." Xavier laughed. "You are as impatient as I am." "I like that about you." He grew more serious. "What about your belongings? Your mother's jewelry and the other things you mentioned?" "I will pack them tonight and bring them to the ranch," Odessa said. "Constance can tell Uncle Bernard whatever lies she wants, but at least I will have the letter to counter her story. And Mr. Pemberton will back me up if needed." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. Xavier explained that the ranch owner would allow them to live in a small cabin on the property, one that was currently being used for storage, but could easily be converted into a comfortable home. It would be modest, just 3 rooms, but it would be theirs. Xavier promised to get everything ready within the week. As for the wedding, they decided to speak with Reverend Matthews, the minister at the Methodist Church, first thing Monday morning. If he agreed to perform the ceremony, they could be married by the end of the week. It was all happening so fast, but neither of them wanted to slow down. They had found each other against all odds, and now that they saw no reason to wait. That evening, when Odessa returned to the Turner house, she found Constance in one of her moods, slamming pots and pans in the kitchen with unnecessary force. Odessa ignored her and went straight to her room, where she began carefully packing her most precious belongings. Her mother's pearl necklace and earrings, the silver brush and mirror set that had been a birthday gift from her father, the quilt her grandmother had sewn by hand, letters and photographs, and a few books. She worked quietly and efficiently, wrapping each item carefully in tissue paper and placing it in her trunk. When everything was packed, she sat down at her writing desk and composed a second, shorter letter to Uncle Bernard. In it, she explained that she had accepted Xavier Harrison's proposal of marriage and would be leaving Fort Kearny to live at the Double H Ranch. She expressed her hope that Uncle Bernard would understand and give them his blessing, but she made it clear that her decision was final. She would not allow Constance's cruelty to dictate the course of her life any longer. She left the letter propped up on the mantel in the parlor, where Uncle Bernard would be sure to find it when he returned. Then she went to bed and slept more soundly than she had in months. Monday morning, Odessa and Xavier met outside the Methodist church and approached Reverend Matthews together. The minister, a kindly man in his 60s with silver hair and warm brown eyes, listened to their story with patience and sympathy. "I must say this is all rather sudden," he said when they had finished. "You have known each other less than 2 weeks." "I know how it sounds," Xavier said, "but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love Odessa and I want to spend the rest of my life with her." "And you, Miss Turner?" Reverend Matthews asked. "Are you certain this is what you want? You are not being coerced or pressured in any way." "I am completely certain," Odessa said firmly. "Xavier has been nothing but kind and respectful to me. He has stood up for me when my own family would not. I know we have not known each other long, but I believe we have something real and lasting." The minister studied them both for a long moment, and Odessa held her breath, afraid he was going to refuse. But then Reverend Matthews smiled. "I have been performing weddings for 30 years, he said, "and I have learned to trust my instincts about people. I can see the sincerity in both of you. If you are both certain this is what you want, then I would be honored to perform the ceremony. When would you like to marry?" "As soon as possible," Xavier said. "This week, if you can arrange it." "How about Friday afternoon?" the minister suggested. "That will give you time to make the necessary arrangements and give me time to prepare. We will need 2 witnesses, of course. Mr. Pemberton from the dry goods store will stand up for me," Odessa said. "He has been very kind through all of this." "And I will ask Tom Henderson, one of the other hands from the ranch," Xavier added. "He is a good man and a good friend." "Excellent," Reverend Matthews said. "Then it is settled. Friday at 2 o'clock, and may God bless your union." They left the church walking on air, their hands clasped tightly together. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation. Xavier made daily trips into town, bringing lumber and supplies to convert the storage cabin into a proper home. Odessa gave her notice at the store, and Mr. Pemberton, while sorry to lose her help, was delighted by the news of her engagement. "That is wonderful, my dear," he said, beaming. "I knew from the moment I saw you with that young man that something special was developing. He is a good sort, I can tell. You will be very happy together." Constance, predictably, was furious when she learned of Odessa's plans. "You are making a terrible mistake," she hissed. "Marrying some drifter you barely know. When this all falls apart, do not come crawling back here expecting sympathy." "I will not," Odessa said calmly, "because it is not going to fall apart, and even if it did, I would rather take my chances with Xavier than spend another day under your roof." On Thursday evening, Odessa's belongings were loaded onto a wagon Xavier had borrowed from the ranch. She took one last look at the Turner house, the place that had been her home for 3 years, and felt no regret at leaving it behind. Whatever happened next, she was moving forward toward a new life, a better life, one built on love and mutual respect rather than obligation and cruelty. Friday dawned clear and bright, a perfect autumn day with just a hint of chill in the air that made the sunshine feel even more precious. Odessa dressed in her mother's wedding dress, which she had carefully altered to fit her own slender frame. It was a simple gown of ivory silk with delicate lace at the throat and wrists, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt her mother's presence like a blessing. Xavier met her at the church, wearing a new suit he had purchased for the occasion, his hair freshly cut and his face shaved smooth. He looked devastatingly handsome, and when his eyes met hers, the love and admiration in them took her breath away. The ceremony was brief and simple. Mr. Pemberton and Tom Henderson, a weathered cowboy with a kind smile, stood as witnesses. Reverend Matthews spoke eloquently about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment and love. And then, Xavier was slipping a simple gold band onto Odessa's finger, and she was doing the same for him, and they were speaking vows that bound them together for the rest of their lives. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Matthews said with a broad smile. "Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Xavier did not need to be told twice. He pulled Odessa into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness and passion that made her heart soar. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just done. They signed the marriage certificate, accepted congratulations from their small party of witnesses, and then climbed into the wagon for the ride to the Double H Ranch. As they left Fort Kearny behind, Odessa looked back once at the town that had been her home, then resolutely turned her face forward toward the future. The Double H Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of rolling prairie, with a main house, several barns and outbuildings, and the small cabin that would now be Odessa and Xavier's home. The cabin was rough but serviceable, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a small bedroom, and a lean-to for storage. Xavier had worked miracles in the past week, installing a new cook stove, repairing the roof, building shelves, and a proper bed frame. It was not fancy, but it was clean and sturdy and full of potential. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrison," Xavier said as he helped Odessa down from the wagon. The words sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Harrison. She had a new name, a new life, a new beginning. Xavier carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the old-fashioned gesture, and then they were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in warm, golden light. Xavier set Odessa down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you," he said. "I know I have not said it enough, but I love you with everything in me. Thank you for taking a chance on me." "I love you too," Odessa whispered, "and I would take that chance 1,000 times over." They spent their first evening as a married couple unpacking Odessa's belongings and arranging them throughout the cabin. They hung her mother's quilt on the wall above the bed. They placed her books on the shelves Xavier had built. They set out her mother's brush and mirror on the washstand. With each item they placed, the cabin felt more like a home. As darkness fell, they sat together on the small porch outside the cabin, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast prairie sky. Xavier's arm was around Odessa's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling safe and content for the first time in years. "Do you think your uncle will ever forgive you?" Xavier asked quietly. "I hope so," Odessa said. "I left him a letter explaining everything. If he is the man I believe him to be, he will understand once he hears the full truth. But even if he does not, I will not regret this decision. You are my family now, Xavier. You and whatever future we build together." Xavier pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We are going to build a good life here, Odessa. I promise you that. It might not always be easy, but it will be ours, built on honesty and love and hard work." "That is all I could ever ask for," Odessa said. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Odessa threw herself into making the cabin a true home, sewing curtains for the windows, planting a small herb garden outside the door, learning to cook on the temperamental cook stove. Xavier continued his work with the horses, and in the evenings he would return to the cabin dusty and tired, but always with a smile for his wife. They learned each other's habits and rhythms, the small details that made up a shared life. Odessa discovered that Xavier liked his coffee strong and black, that he was an early riser who greeted each day with enthusiasm, that he sang off-key when he was happy. Xavier learned that Odessa was fiercely organized, that she had a sharp wit and loved to read, that she made the best apple pie he had ever tasted. They also learned about each other's pasts, sharing stories and memories late into the night. Xavier told Odessa about his difficult childhood, about watching his mother struggle and sacrifice to keep their small farm afloat after his father's death. He spoke of the guilt he had felt leaving her to go west, even though she had insisted it was what he needed to do. Odessa in turn shared memories of her parents, the happy years before illness had torn her family apart, and the loneliness of being passed from relative to relative after their deaths. These conversations deepened their bond, transforming what had begun as attraction and infatuation into something richer and more profound. They were building not just a home but a partnership, a true marriage based on mutual understanding and respect. 1 month after their wedding, Odessa received a letter forwarded from Fort Kearny. Her hands trembled as she recognized Uncle Bernard's handwriting on the envelope. Xavier was out working with the horses, so she was alone as she carefully opened the letter and began to read. Her uncle's words were carefully chosen, and she could sense the struggle behind them. He wrote that he had been shocked and hurt to return to Fort Kearny and find her gone, married to a man he had never met. Constance had filled his ears with terrible accusations against both Odessa and Xavier, painting them as opportunists and liars. But Mr. Pemberton had sought Bernard out and told him a very different story, one that matched the account Odessa had written in her letters. Bernard wrote that he had confronted Constance with these contradictions, and under pressure, his wife had eventually admitted to her cruelty. She had confessed to locking Odessa out, to making false accusations, to trying to drive her away out of jealousy and spite. The revelation had shaken Bernard to his core, and he wrote that he was deeply ashamed for having been so blind to what was happening in his own household. The letter went on to express Bernard's hope that Odessa could forgive him for failing to protect her. He wrote that he had dissolved his marriage to Constance, who had already left Fort Kearny for parts unknown. He expressed his desire to meet Xavier and give his belated blessing to their marriage, and he asked, humbly, if Odessa might consider visiting him in Fort Kearny so they could reconcile. Odessa read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. When Xavier returned that evening, he found her sitting at the small kitchen table, the letter spread out before her, her eyes red from crying. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, kneeling beside her chair. "Bad news." "No," Odessa said, managing a watery smile. Good news, actually. My uncle wrote. He knows the truth about Constance now. He has left her and he wants to see me. He wants to meet you and give us his blessing." Xavier's face lit up. "That is wonderful news. Why are you crying?" "Because I am happy," Odessa said, laughing through her tears. "Because my uncle believes me. Because I have not lost my family after all." They traveled to Fort Kearny the following week. Bernard Turner proved to be a pleasant surprise, a man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and a genuine warmth that immediately put Xavier at ease. He welcomed them into his home, apologizing profusely to Odessa for having doubted her and thanking Xavier for standing up for her when he had failed to do so. "You are a good man," Bernard told Xavier over dinner that evening. "I can see how much you care for my niece. I am grateful that she found you when she needed help most." "I am the lucky one," Xavier said, reaching over to take Odessa's hand. "She could have had her pick of men, but she chose me." "We chose each other," Odessa corrected with a smile. They spent several days in Fort Kearny, repairing the rift that Constance's cruelty had created. Bernard shared stories of Odessa's parents, his brother and sister-in-law whom he had loved dearly. He expressed his deep regret for having allowed Constance to come between him and his niece, and he vowed never to let it happen again. When it came time for Odessa and Xavier to return to the ranch, Bernard pressed a small leather pouch into Odessa's hands. "Your inheritance from your parents," he explained. "It is not much, but I have been holding it in trust for you. Use it to build your future." Inside the pouch, Odessa found $300 in gold coins, a small fortune by frontier standards. She tried to refuse, but Bernard would not hear of it. "It is yours by right," he said firmly. "Your parents would want you to have it. Use it wisely." Back at the ranch, Odessa and Xavier discussed what to do with the unexpected windfall. They decided to save most of it, but use a portion to make improvements to the cabin and to purchase a few head of cattle. If they could build up a small herd, they could eventually start their own ranch rather than relying solely on Xavier's wages. The months passed, and their lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. Xavier continued to work with the horses, earning a reputation as one of the best horse breakers in the territory. The ranch owner, impressed by Xavier's skills and work ethic, promoted him to head wrangler and gave him a substantial raise. Odessa tended their growing garden, sold eggs and vegetables to neighboring ranches, and carefully managed their finances. By the following spring, they had saved enough money to purchase 10 head of cattle and lease additional grazing land from the Double H. It was a small start, but it was theirs, and they were building it together. One warm May evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Odessa placed Xavier's hand on her stomach and gave him a smile filled with joy and anticipation. "We are going to have a baby," she said softly. "You are going to be a father." Xavier's eyes went wide with shock, then blazing with happiness. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, his face buried in her hair. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Odessa asked, though she already knew the answer from the tremor in his voice. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Xavier said. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You have given me everything, Odessa. A home, a purpose, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. And now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you said yes when I asked you to marry me." "I thank God for you too," Odessa said. "For that day at the livery stable when you saw a stranger in distress and decided to help. You saved me, Xavier, in more ways than I can count." Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1875, after a long and difficult labor. Xavier paced outside the cabin while the ranch owner's wife, Mrs. Henderson, assisted with the delivery. When he finally heard the thin, angry cry of a newborn, he burst through the door to find Odessa exhausted but beaming, a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets cradled in her arms. "A boy," she said softly. "We have a son." Xavier approached slowly, almost reverently, and gazed down at the tiny red face peeking out from the blankets. "He is perfect," he breathed. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking James," Odessa said. "James Bernard Harrison, after both our fathers." "James," Xavier repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Welcome to the world, James Harrison. You have a lot of people who already love you." The baby grew quickly, thriving under his parents' devoted care. Uncle Bernard visited often, delighting in his great-nephew and bringing gifts and supplies. The small ranch continued to prosper, as Xavier's reputation brought in additional work breaking horses for neighboring spreads. Odessa sold her eggs and vegetables, and took in sewing when she could spare the time from caring for James. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a healthy girl with Xavier's dark hair and Odessa's green eyes. They named her Sarah Catherine, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when money was tight and resources were scarce. There were droughts that tested the cattle herd and storms that damaged buildings and equipment. Xavier suffered a broken arm when a particularly wild horse threw him, and Odessa had a bout of pneumonia that scared them both badly. But through all the challenges and hardships, they faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. They built additions onto the cabin as their family grew, transforming it from a rough bachelor's dwelling into a real home filled with laughter and warmth. They increased their cattle herd gradually, year by year, until they had enough to truly call themselves ranchers rather than just ranch hands. By 1880, 7 years after that fateful day when Odessa had been locked out of her uncle's house, Xavier and Odessa Harrison owned 300 head of cattle, leased 200 acres of grazing land, and had 2 healthy, happy children. Their cabin had grown into a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a parlor where neighbors would gather for dances and social events. Xavier had been offered the position of foreman at the Double H Ranch, but after much discussion, he and Odessa had declined. They wanted to continue building their own operation, to create something that would be their legacy to pass down to James and Sarah. Uncle Bernard retired from running his dry goods store and came to live with them for several months each year, delighting in spoiling his great-niece and great-nephew. He never remarried after his disastrous union with Constance, saying that he had learned his lesson about rushing into relationships without truly knowing a person's character. On their 7th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Odessa took an evening walk together, leaving the children with Uncle Bernard. They walked out across the prairie, hand in hand, to a high point that overlooked their ranch and the miles of open land stretching in every direction. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked as they stood watching the sunset. "Marrying me so quickly, taking such a risk on someone you barely knew." Odessa turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for one single moment. You gave me back my life when I had lost hope. You gave me a home where I am valued and loved. You gave me a family and a future. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Xavier pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I think about that day sometimes when I found you sitting outside the livery stable. What if I had just ridden past? What if I had not stopped to see if you were all right?" "But you did stop," Odessa said. "You saw someone in need and you helped, even though you had no obligation to do so." "That is who you are, Xavier. That is why I fell in love with you." "I am glad I stopped," Xavier said softly, "because finding you was like finding the missing piece of myself that I did not even know was gone." They stood together in silence for a long time, watching the sky fade from gold to pink to purple as the stars began to emerge. In the distance, they could hear James and Sarah's laughter floating on the evening breeze, the sound of Uncle Bernard's deeper voice telling them some story or other. "I want to expand the house again," Odessa said eventually. "Add a proper dining room and maybe a covered porch that wraps around the whole building, somewhere we can sit in the evenings and watch the children play." "We can do that," Xavier said. "We will start planning it next week." "What else do you want?" "More cattle," Odessa said thoughtfully, "and maybe some chickens. Sarah has been begging for chickens, and I want to plant fruit trees, apple and cherry, so that in a few years we will have our own orchard." Xavier chuckled. "Is that all?" "For now," Odessa said with a smile. "I will think of more things later, I am sure." "I am sure you will," Xavier agreed, "and we will build it all piece by piece, year by year, together." "Together," Odessa echoed. As they walked back to the house, their hands clasped tightly together, Odessa thought about how much her life had changed since that terrible day in September, 7 years ago. She had gone from being locked out of her home by a cruel relative to building a new home, a better home, with a man who loved and respected her beyond measure. The key Xavier had given her that day was not just a key to a physical door. It was a key to a new life, a new future, a chance at happiness she had thought was lost forever. He had broken the lock that held her captive to other people's cruelty and given her the freedom to choose her own path, and what a path it had been. Full of love and laughter, hard work and hardship, triumph and challenges overcome together. It was not the life she had imagined for herself when she was a young girl in Pennsylvania, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have dreamed. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. James grew into a strong, capable young man who shared his father's gift for working with horses. Sarah proved to have her mother's head for numbers and business, keeping meticulous records of the ranch's inventory and finances even as a young girl. When James was 18 and Sarah 16, Xavier and Odessa finally purchased the land they had been leasing all those years, making it officially theirs. The Harrison Ranch, as it was now known throughout the territory, had grown to encompass 800 acres and nearly 500 head of cattle. They employed 3 full-time ranch hands and hired additional help during branding and harvest seasons. Uncle Bernard passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, leaving his entire estate to Odessa and her children. It was not a fortune by any means, but it was enough to pay off the last of their debts and make significant improvements to the ranch infrastructure. On what would have been their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Odessa with a gift. He led her out to the barn and showed her a new sign he had carved and painted, ready to be mounted over the ranch entrance. "The Harrison Ranch," Odessa read aloud. "Established 1873. "The year we met," Xavier explained. "The year everything changed. I wanted to commemorate it properly." Odessa's eyes filled with tears. "It is perfect. Everything is perfect." Xavier pulled her into his arms. "Not everything. We have had our share of struggles and sorrows. But we have faced them together, and that has made all the difference." "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Odessa asked. "When you found me outside the livery stable," Xavier thought for a moment, then smiled. "I asked if you were all right." "And I lied and said I was fine," Odessa recalled, "even though I was about as far from fine as a person could be." "You looked so lost and hurt," Xavier said. "I could not just ride past and do nothing. And I am forever grateful that you did not," Odessa said. She stood on her toes and kissed him, a kiss that still held all the passion and love of their first kiss 2 decades earlier. "Thank you for stopping. Thank you for helping. Thank you for loving me." "Thank you for saying yes," Xavier replied. "For taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing to offer but hard work and an honest heart." "You offered me everything that mattered," Odessa said. "A home where I was valued, a partnership built on respect, a love that has only grown stronger with time. You gave me the key to my own happiness, Xavier, and I will never stop being grateful for that." They stood together in the barn, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the ranch they had built together, and Odessa reflected on how far they had come. From that desperate day when Constance had locked her out, to this moment of peace and prosperity and profound contentment, life had not been easy, but it had been good. It had been real. It had been theirs. And as Xavier took her hand and led her back to the house where their children waited, where dinner was cooking on the stove and the lamps were being lit against the gathering darkness, Odessa knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing about the path that had brought her here. Because sometimes, she thought, the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones. Sometimes being locked out of one home is what allows us to find our way to another, better home, one built not on obligation or charity, but on love and choice and mutual commitment. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, a cowboy comes along at exactly the right moment, breaks the lock that holds us captive, and gives us the key to our own future. As they reached the house and the door swung open to reveal their children's smiling faces, Odessa sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for that September day in 1873, when Xavier Harrison had stopped to help a stranger in distress. It had been the beginning of everything that mattered. It had been the beginning of home. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask about how they met and fell in love, Odessa and Xavier would sit together on the wide wraparound porch they had finally built, their hands clasped together as they had been for decades, and they would tell the story. They would talk about a cruel relative and a locked door, about a kind cowboy who could not walk past someone in need, about a proposal made too quickly and accepted anyway, because sometimes the heart knows things the head cannot yet understand, about building a life together from nothing, brick by brick, year by year, challenge by challenge overcome. And their grandchildren would listen wide-eyed, enthralled by this real-life fairy tale about how love could triumph over cruelty, how kindness could change everything, how two strangers could meet and recognize in each other the missing piece they had been searching for all along. The Harrison Ranch thrived for generations, a testament to what could be built when two people chose each other, chose love, chose to face life's challenges together rather than alone. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original cabin where it all began was preserved, a reminder of humble beginnings and the power of hope. Xavier and Odessa Harrison lived long, full lives surrounded by children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. They faced joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, but they faced it all together, their hands clasped as tightly on their last day as they had been on their first. And when people spoke of the Harrison Ranch and the family that built it, they always started with the same story about a young woman locked out of her home by a cruel relative, and the cowboy who broke the lock and gave her the key to a new life, a better life, a life built on love. Because in the end, that was what it all came down to. Love freely given and freely received, a choice made in a moment that echoed through generations, a risk taken that paid dividends beyond measure. Xavier gave Odessa a key that day, but Odessa gave Xavier something equally precious, a reason to stop drifting, a place to belong, a heart to call home. They saved each other in all the ways that mattered, and they lived, truly lived, happily ever after.